Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into one of the most famous and, let's be honest, absolutely terrifying alien abduction stories in American history. We're going to peel back the layers of a story that completely captivated a small town, enriched a tabloid, and eventually morphed into a multi-million-dollar Hollywood blockbuster. So grab your notepads because we are looking at the fascinating anatomy of an alien myth.
Okay, let's dive into this. If you grew up in the 90s, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The alien abduction scenes in the movie Fire in the Sky are straight-up nightmare fuel. But behind all that sheer cinematic terror lies a really fascinating tension. The film's own director, Robert Lieberman, actually had strong suspicions about the real-life events the movie was based on. Decades after filming it, he suggested the real event might have just been a prank. In his own words, he suspected the logging crew probably laced their beer with a little acid at the end of the day, put on a show, and just started believing it. So how on earth did a potential prank out in the woods turn into a massive global phenomenon?
Well, first, we need to look at Hollywood's terrifying version of this alien abduction.
To really understand this myth, we've got to start with that 1993 film Fire in the Sky. It raked in nearly $20 million at the box office and fundamentally shaped how an entire generation pictured extraterrestrial abduction. But here is the ultimate Hollywood irony for you. The most iconic, horrifying scenes in that movie, the zero-gravity cocoons filled with decomposing remains, that terrifying examination where a gelatinous substance is forced into Travis Walton's mouth, the needle probe, literally none of that is what he claimed happened to him. Screenwriter Tracy Torme actually admitted that studio executives found Walton's real, published account completely boring, so they just insisted on fictionalizing the entire abduction sequence for the big screen. That cinematic trauma that scarred millions of viewers? Yeah, it was entirely fabricated just to sell tickets.
Let's move on and see how this builds, starting with the real 1975 incident.
Right, so to find the true story, we have to strip away all those Hollywood special effects and travel back to November 1975 to the freezing, isolated woods of the White Mountains in Arizona. Here's the factual timeline that everyone involved actually agrees on. On November 5th, a 7-man logging crew is driving home when they see this unearthly glow in the trees. 22-year-old Travis Walton gets out of the truck to investigate, is allegedly struck by a beam of light, and just vanishes. For the next few days, local police, including Sheriff Blake Davis, aren't suspecting aliens. They suspect murder. They think the crew killed Walton, which leads to intense social ostracization and polygraph tests for all the men. Then, suddenly on November 10th, 5 days later, Walton mysteriously reappears at a gas station in Heber, Arizona. He's severely dehydrated, traumatized, and claims he was taken aboard a spacecraft.
Travis Walton would eventually codify his experience in a 1978 book called The Walton Experience, which, by the way, is what the movie was eventually based on. He claimed he was struck by that blinding light while working out there on a logging contract. This book really served as the foundational text for his claims, detailing all his memories of being taken aboard a UFO. But long before that book ever hit the shelves, the media frenzy had already completely exploded.
And that explosion started locally. Just 4 days after Walton reappeared, the White Mountain Independent, which is a small-town weekly newspaper right near the abduction site, ran this massive story. By publishing eyewitness corroboration from the logging crew right there in the hometown paper, the story gained this immediate, deeply rooted credibility. It wasn't just some passing rumor, it was front-page news in the community where these men lived and worked. And that local credibility acted like a massive beacon for the national press.
Which perfectly sets the stage for a complete tabloid media circus.
Within hours of Walton's reappearance, this sleepy Arizona desert town was basically invaded by the national media. Specifically, we're talking about reporters from the National Enquirer. They came armed with deep pockets and a mandate to secure exclusive rights to the story, rights they absolutely knew could be worth millions in the booming UFO market of the 1970s. Now, what's really interesting here is the sheer, unfiltered reality of checkbook journalism. This is from Jeff Wells, a reporter for the Enquirer at the time. To keep competing journalists and the local sheriff away from Travis, the Enquirer reporters literally bribed Walton's brother with $1,000. They took the family, hid them in a luxury motel on the outskirts of town under fake names, and essentially created a complete media blackout to secure a monopoly on the story.
Honestly, if you thought the movie was wild, the true story of what went down in that motel room is even stranger. Just picture this eclectic cast of characters trapped together in the desert heat. You've got the haunted, twitching 22-year-old Travis. You have his brother described by the reporter as this ruthless, highly protective rodeo cowboy. You've got Jeff Wells, the dapper English tabloid reporter trying to manage the chaos. Then, enter Professor James A. Harder, a ufologist from California flown in to help, who immediately starts bonding with the cowboy brother over his own childhood UFO sightings. And finally, a husband and wife team of psychiatrists flown in all the way from Colorado. This bizarre group had to somehow nail down a coherent story before a film crew from CBS's 60 Minutes arrived.
And as you might guess, the investigation inside that luxury motel quickly devolved into total chaos. First, the ufologist professor hypnotizes Walton to get the story out of him, which results in this tale about little men with fishbowl heads. But the strain of this causes Walton to suffer severe, sobbing breakdowns, so the reporters fly in those Colorado psychiatrists to tranquilize Walton and keep his protective brother from totally exploding. By the end of this bizarre psychological intervention, the psychiatrists actually lock themselves in a room, order 2 bottles of cognac, and end up rolling drunk. They basically concluded Walton likely just had a powerful hallucination triggered by some eerie light in the woods.
But of course, that brings us to the polygraph and the potential hoax.
See, the tabloid reporters couldn't exactly sell a story about a hallucination. They needed concrete proof of an alien abduction. Which brings us to the most tightly guarded secret of the entire 1975 incident, the lie detector test. So the crucial point here is the massive discrepancy between what the public was told and what actually happened behind closed doors. The National Enquirer published a sensational front-page story claiming the witnesses passed a lie detector test, and they even awarded the logging crew a $5,000 prize for the most impressive UFO incident of 1975. But the secret reality? The tabloid had arranged a private polygraph test for Travis Walton with John J. McCarthy, the most experienced examiner in Arizona. And according to reporter Jeff Wells, Walton failed the test miserably. The examiner actually called it the plainest case of lying he'd seen in 20 years. But the Enquirer and the ufologists, they just completely buried this failed test from the public.
Naturally, this hidden failure fueled some intense skepticism. In 1976, Philip J. Klass, a really prominent UFO investigator and skeptic, issued a white paper characterizing the whole event as a calculated hoax. His investigation revealed that secretly failed polygraphs and suggested a remarkably grounded motive. Klass theorized that the entire UFO abduction story was contrived simply to get the logging crew out of a delinquent government timber cutting contract. They were severely behind on the contract because they'd been moonlighting on other, better-paying jobs. I mean, we've all needed an excuse for missing a deadline at work, right? But they apparently needed an act of God, or in this case, an act of aliens, to get out of it without a huge penalty.
And what makes this skeptical theory so fascinating is how it perfectly aligns with the undisputed facts of the crew's situation. Even 50 years later, during a recent interview on Fox 10 Phoenix, Travis Walton himself brought up the immense pressure they were under. He stated, "We've been putting in long days and needed to finish the contract. A few more long days and we'd have it all done." The stress of that looming government deadline is a verified fact. It's acknowledged by both believers and skeptics alike, serving as the very real backdrop for whatever truly happened that night in the woods.
So, let's take a look at the anatomy of this myth.
How do we piece all this together? We have a stressed-out logging crew, a bizarre disappearance, a media frenzy, buried evidence, and Hollywood embellishment. Layer by layer, we can see exactly how a modern myth is constructed, and more importantly, monetized. And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer economic momentum of the Travis Walton story. It started with a $1,000 bribe from a tabloid reporter just to hide the family in a motel. That investment paid off when the crew was awarded a $5,000 prize which validated their story in the eyes of UFO enthusiasts. And then, that validation snowballs over 2 decades, culminating in a Hollywood film that generated nearly $20 million at the box office. Financial incentives were baked into this story from day 5, pushing it from a weird local police matter to a massive global entertainment product.
Which leaves us with the ultimate question to ponder today. When you step back and look at the documented history, the buried polygraph, the drunken psychiatrist, the tabloid bribes, and the Hollywood executives demanding a better abduction scene, what are we really looking at? Is the Travis Walton incident the ultimate proof of extraterrestrial visitation? Or is it a masterclass in how the pressure of an unpaid logging contract, combined with a media machine hungry for a story, can snowball into a $19 million blockbuster myth? I'll leave that for you to decide. Thanks for joining us on The Explainer, and as always, keep asking questions.